So welcome to the fourth in this series of revisiting Whitley Lectures from the past. The Whitley Lecture has been around since the middle of the 20th century, was revived in the middle of the 1990s and continues to go through. And there's a couple of us who have delivered the Whitley Lecture on the call tonight previously, as well as others who I know have engaged with it and read it and stuff. So we come to this fourth one in our series, and it's called Seen and Heard: Reflections on Children and the Baptist Tradition, which was given by Anne Dunkley. Her name now is Anne Phillips. Anne taught for many years at Northern Baptist College, finishing as co-principal, and her PhD was on the faith in girls, which came later after this lecture, but her interest in children and the faith of children has been there for many years. So it's great to revisit this lecture. So just to share that my own MTH at Regent's Park College in Oxford was on Baptist and children, and so I have a little bit of familiarity with some of what we might explore this evening, but hopefully we're going to have another rich conversation. So just a little bit of an intro to what Anne talks about in her lecture. She begins by saying it's an important statement that she was asked to deliver this lecture on children and Baptists, which, I think this is the really interesting thing about these early lectures. I think most people were probably asked, would they give it? And here, this fourth one, having had one on women in ministry, one on politics, and one on the Lord's Supper, this fourth one is here on children. Which I guess there had been something of a group of people thinking about children in Baptist life within the Baptist Union, and Anne was one of those people, and so she perhaps was a natural choice to be asked. But here, Baptists were asked to consider and think about children right at the end of the 20th century. She begins by talking about how children are created whole. So they're not, since they're already persons from the moment they're born, and they are those who are receptive to God. And then she talks about that and giving some examples from scripture and exploring in that kind of way. And then ends up in that kind of section talking about how childhood is not something that is left behind, gathering on the work of Karl Rahner there. So it's not something that, once we're children, then we become adults, but actually we remain in this sense of our childhood. It shapes us throughout our lives in different ways. So I should quickly say, these are just some of the things that I noticed as I reread it earlier today. There are other things that we might want to pick up as we explore it. On page 12, she talks about the challenges to childhood. Obviously, childhood was something in many ways invented in the Victorian era. It wasn't something that was there before, but she talks about how, I guess there's this idea of innocence and joy and playfulness of being a child, but she talks about actually by the end of the 20th century, there are certain challenges to being children, and it might be that we want to reflect on what other challenges there are now, 25 years nearly into the 21st century. But then page 15, she talks about children as being those who have an openness to spirituality, drawing on the work of David Hay and Rebecca Nye and upon others, which was, I guess, kind of when Anne was writing at this point, was kind of groundbreaking. This idea that children were spiritual beings, and talking about it in that kind of language was not something that probably was at least mainstream in our churches before that point. And then she talks, I think, in quite a helpful way, page 17 now, about there's three ways that we might think about the spiritual lives of children. One is their innate human spirituality. We are all spiritual beings, I guess, in that kind of sense. The second one, the importance of what she calls a devotional spirituality, of a faith community and being part of that, and how that might shape children's faith and their spirituality. And then a practical spirituality that is about relating to the wider world. And I guess the world that children find themselves, young people find themselves in. And all three of these ways that we might think about spirituality are important if the spiritual life of children are going to be nurtured and faith is going to be nurtured. And then she asks a question at the end of page 17 where it says, does the way we do church tidy them away? Which I thought was a really interesting question, which we might come back to in any kind of conversation that we have. Does the way we do church tidy them away? The next section of her lecture then looks at kind of how childhood and children have been thought about in Baptist history. She looks right at the back of the beginnings, where the idea that children were those who were outside the church, because of that idea of believers' baptism, obviously. And so that faith comes by teaching, that the idea of actually is of the child being taught here right at that early stage about parents actually teaching their child. And so that they might come to a point of conversion and believers' baptism. So this idea of the spiritual life of children was probably not there in the same way. At the same time, there's always been this Baptist idea amongst general and particular Baptists that if the child died in childhood, they were still safe in God, and even though they might not have been baptized. So that was the idea running. She talks there on page 23 about play was scorned. This idea that children should be playful or doing play was not one that was around in the 17th or 18th century. And again, we might think actually we've moved on and might see some more positive ideas about play, even amongst adults doing play as well. Then the next section, she talks about the beginning and the emergence of the Sunday school movement, which was massive. And there, I guess the idea of the child being taught by the parents shifts to the child being taught in Sunday school, which at the beginning wasn't really how we might think about Sunday school in perhaps many of our churches, or at least many of the churches that we might have grown up in through the 70s and 80s. But this idea of something separate, which actually at the beginning was about being taught to read. But how do you learn to read? Well, you learn to read by learning to read the Bible and learning to read hymns and things like that. But that idea of the Sunday school movement imposing a set of values, she says on page 25, a set of values and practices from which churches are still struggling today. So the Sunday school movement, she wants to argue, still shapes massively how we think about the place of children and how children might be nurtured in faith. We might want to come back and talk about that. Page 26, she has a great quote about buttocks, which I just thought if you revisited it, I just thought I highlight that. One writer, she says, described the buttocks as specially created by God to receive just correction in childhood without serious bodily injury. I'll leave that one with you, and perhaps we want to come back to that as well. We might want to come back to that in the light of particular coming to the light if you caught up with anything to do with Soul Survivor and Mike Pilavachi. Not to say that he was doing physical things, but anyway, we might come back to that. But she talks about actually how the Sunday school movement emerged and distanced parents and the role that they might have played within the nurturing of the faith of children. And again, I think we still live with that in many places, actually. The idea is actually it's the church or Sunday school or whatever that kind of youth group, whatever it might be, is the place where children talk about faith rather than perhaps in the home. We might want to come back and talk about that as well. She sees a massive shift with the work of Hamilton. Hamilton having this idea that the child is a growing, developing person, page 31. And again, this idea of, where she began, the child is created whole, the sense of children being persons, has been something I think that shaped education and lots of other places, church perhaps being a little bit slower to catch on to some of those ideas. And then Hamilton also going on, page 32, to say that the school setting he saw became inappropriate for sharing faith. And we needed new places. And one, part of his argument was around family church and the child experiencing faith within the whole body of the church and not separated out into the Sunday school. And I think we've taken on some of those ideas, but we perhaps live with the two things alongside one another at the same time of the Sunday school and the child being actually in church. But I thought it was a really interesting thing when she quotes from some of the work that Chris Ellis did and how she discovered again at the end of the 90s how many children were not really present in church in a kind of worship setting at that point. I would imagine or hope, fairly confident that is probably shifted in the last 25 years, that children are now more present. But again, it'd be interesting perhaps to talk about that. She talks on page 33 as actually the importance for children to belong in a meaningful way. And what that belonging might mean, she doesn't, she said right at the beginning of the lecture, this isn't about giving some kind of set ways of doing these things, but that belonging needing to be in a meaningful way. And how Baptists, again, from the mid-20th century onwards, had talked about reinventing the catechumenate as one place of seeing children as those who are on the journey towards baptism, and not as an intentional thing. That idea of catechumenate, I guess, has been around in some of the thinking, in practice, I'm not sure really it's ever landed in terms of the churches in some kind of way. Page 35, she talks about that this importance of a mutual exchange between children and adults. So in a way that children can contribute something to the faith of adults, and in a similar way that faith of adults can shape the faith of children. This mutual exchange, rather than being a one-way, which again, I guess perhaps is still largely the way that we think about it, is it's about what we can put into children rather than often what children might bring. And again, it might be an interesting conversation. And Linda, who's on the call this evening, her work and her Whitley lecture about children and communion, I think was really interesting in thinking about some of those issues. She talks on page 36 about, towards the end of the lecture now, that it's important that whatever we do with children and how we might help them belong in a meaningful way focuses on their experience and is about their concerns. So it's rooted in the life that children might have today, in terms of their school life, in terms of the society, all those kind of things that are shaping them. Church should relate into some of those and not kind of be distant to them. And then she asks on page 36, let me just get this right. She asked the question, if we're not doing those things, we are failing them. Actually, we're failing to help children nurture their spiritual lives and their faith lives. So I think in this lecture, she's probably doing, which some of the lectures I also do, is bringing some thinking which was amongst many who had been working with children, at least in the academy and in certain kind of ecumenical settings, and bringing it to a wider audience, probably to Baptists for the first time. And it'd be interesting to say, what kind of impact did her lecture have? But I do think there's we are beginning to think about children differently than perhaps we were for most of the 20th century. And this lecture perhaps played a part in that. So those were the things that I kind of highlighted in just, or struck me as I was reading it. And perhaps those, just going back to some of those questions that she asks, again, does the way we do church tidy them away? The importance of the positives of the Sunday school movement, but also its negatives. And how do we make sure that we're not failing children in what we offer in terms of church in those ways? So, what did you make of the lecture? Are there particular things that you want to engage with, questions? And again, part of what we might want to do is draw on our own experiences and our own congregations and in our places. Maybe even our own growing up in church. Maybe we recognize something of what Anne was talking about ourselves.
I mean, I think one of the points you've already made, Andy, is that question of, this is 25 years ago, when she's saying things about young people, children are marginalized, they're overlooked, even use the words oppressed. I'd be really interested to compare, seeing as there's now half the number of children within churches, and she says this is directed at children within churches, and what she's talking about, if they feel any less marginalized, oppressed, or overlooked. Because I have a suspicion that, unlike some of the other Whitley lectures we talked about before, which did have an impact, and you can root Operation Violet and all that sort of stuff, Project Violet, going back to some of those. I'm not sure within Baptists particularly, this has led until quite recently to much more reflection, but that might just be my perception. I've sort of looked through some of this stuff.
Yeah.
Brought back a lot of thoughts for me. I remember when I was 10 in 1982, our church got a Robert Raikes plate. Did anybody else ever see these? They were a limited edition. We used to use it for taking up the collection. So massive, great, huge thing with Robert Raikes on it. And then more recently, I've discovered his statue down in Embankment Gardens. There's a big statue of him just kind of south of the Ritz in Embankment Gardens. But that was, aside from the kind of Robert Raikes thing, I was really interested in the theological argument she was making about childhood being kind of complete in and of itself, as part of a person's totality. I mean, it's kind of almost process theology. I mean, she doesn't quite name it as that, I don't think, but this idea that, you know, whatever our lives' eternal value and it being may be, it enfolds all of our lives redeemed. Not, you know, it's not a final salary pension scheme that pays out depending on where you were at the end. It embraces all of it. And I quite liked that argument about how life fits within eternity. So that really made me think. And the other thing was this thing about Sunday school. So a couple of sharing from experiences. In my first church, we had a sort of mother congregation, which was the large charismatic evangelical one, and then we had a subsidiary congregation on a council estate nearby, which met in a school hall, and it was basically dying on its feet. And we just decided to completely change it and run what was basically like a holiday club every Sunday. And the entire church became focused around children every Sunday. And the children led the prayers and the children did the worship. And actually, quite a number of the adults drifted off and some went back to the mother church and others stayed. But then some of these kids who were coming, some of their parents came along, and then we had a little discussion group for the parents. And you know, it was an absolute transformation of a council estate school, of a council estate church in a school, based around refocusing the whole thing around children. I mean, I've always longed to redo it, but central London doesn't have the same opportunities. I mean, if we're lucky, we get one child a week, and often we get none because we just don't. And that kind of makes me think, what do we do now with our kids? And we don't even have enough children to make it worth running a traditional Sunday school. So we've just turned the little side chapel into a playroom, and the kids kind of free range between there and the church. And, you know, if they want to have a bit of time out, they go in there. And if they want to come and sit in the church, they come and sit in the church. And sometimes they come out for the music because they like the music. And that reminded me of something in, I don't know if anybody else has read the Phil Rickman stories about Merrily Watkins, the diocesan deliverance consultant in Herefordshire. She's the diocesan exorcist. They're kind of horror books. But anyway, she's a single mum exorcist, Anglican. And she's got this daughter called Jane. And I was trying to find the quote earlier, and I can't, so I'm going to have to do it from memory. But there's one moment where Jane is talking to her mum about what it was like growing up in church. And her mum's going like, I've got to do something for the children. I've got to entertain them. I've got to educate them. And Jane said, oh, don't do any of that. Just make them sit there. They'll learn mystery. Try and keep them out and they'll batter the door to come down. Just don't try and pander to them, because what they need to learn is mystery. I thought that's really interesting. So anyway, a few slightly random thoughts that may contribute and spark things for others.
Yeah, thanks, Simon. Other initial responses from anyone?
I suppose for me, one of the things that struck me rereading it was kind of, I really enjoyed that richness of their theological reflection around children and childhood, and, you know, starting with that. And that's a statement in itself, I think, isn't it, about, you know, how we view children and childhood. So yeah, I think that, and then the other half, because it's quite different, aren't they, in terms of, you know, the Baptist ecclesiology and what have you, and how much has changed. And I guess that's a question I kind of was asking as well, more recently, and how much has changed. And yeah, and I think it's quite challenging, because I guess there's lots of different experiences, and for some children and some churches, I love Simon's example there, you know, there might well be very different expressions, but with the young people I worked with on my research, they were out of the way as well. You know, they're in for a little bit of the service, and they talked about being out of the way and not being included. So you do kind of wonder, and it'd be fascinating. And I know to do a lot more work, you know, broadly within the Baptist family. And I know the Children, Youth and Families Round Table are trying to hear from young people currently about their experiences of, well, I don't know what questions they're asking them, but they want to hear from them and from the life of our Baptist churches. So it would be, I think it made me think about that. And yeah, it'd be good to have more perspectives from the children and young people themselves.
Mm. 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 I think she says something, I think, which is quite helpful, that there isn't, she doesn't, you know, she doesn't suggest at the end that we should do family church and have that terminology, which might problematic. We shouldn't do all age church or whatever all the time, but neither should we do segregated into our different age groups all the time. And I think I agree with that. It's good to sometimes be in a place which is, you know, amongst your peers, and you can engage in a particular way. At the same time, it's really important, I think, to be in intergenerational spaces as well, and we learn from both. And I guess that's what, in terms of my own congregation and what I'm trying to do, I guess I'm trying to do a mixture of those things. You know, because I think there's this, we can have this idea of the child, which again sometimes I think it doesn't really hit the reality, which is, you know, they just want the mystery and they want this wonderful thing, but actually sometimes they can't wait to get out of the all age bit and into their own groups. And you know, at the same time, they can bring something really special into that whole kind of setting. And so it's yeah.
And I think that's the point. That I mean, when Linda did her talk, I had this lovely picture of communion as represented by coins, which I was listening when we were at Cardiff Baptist College, and it was absolutely fascinating as a picture. And I'll see if I can remember it properly. Linda will tell me I'm wrong, but this was a young person's description of communion, where the adults were pound coins in a sort of a horseshoe, and they would open a little bit to let the young people in who were 20p's. And that whole dynamic of, well, why are adults pound coins and children's 20p's, people are asking? And why is the circle only partly open? And why are they still other? And I think part of what she's saying is we need to listen. The children need to be seen and heard, not just because they deserve to be, not just because they are worthy of that, but we actually need to hear them. They live in different culture, they have different views, and they have a different understanding, expression of God. And as adults, why would we not want to embrace that? And yet that picture showed the experience as a tentative belonging. You're sort of welcome, but our circle is still only a horseshoe. And I thought that was a fantastic, deep image that you could just go on thinking about for a long time from what Linda had found.
Mm-hmm. Is there something there about the importance of honouring childhood, but also honouring adulthood? It's not that we think one is, you know, sometimes it does feel like the child becomes the complete focus, and unless you're amazingly skilled, that can become a very dumbing down type thing. But then equally, we want, you know, the other view is that adulthood is about everything, and childhood is this thing that we're just trying to get, you know, that we try and move on from. And for me, it seems to be a healthy church is one, well, healthy society is one that seems to honour childhood as its own thing, which I think is what, you know, Anne is trying to say, as well as wanting to honour adulthood as its own thing. And in one sense, children are always, they're on a journey towards adulthood, but equally adults never leave completely their childhood or their being children, if we think about being children of God, behind. And I guess a good church is one it's finding ways that children have respect for adults and adults have respect for children, and that kind of mutual, well, I guess that's what, you know, that mutual exchange is where, you know, part of what Anne ends up. Yeah. James, Ewan, what's it like in your congregations, the place of children? And
yeah, I mean, I think I responded to the paper maybe more with my pastor's hat on than as a theologian primarily. I think it just put me in mind of all the many things we've tried and mostly failed to do at Heath Street over the years to kind of, you know, honor children and bring their spirituality into the worship. It's a mixed picture, and I think it's kind of often, you know, in church life, things don't kind of cohere quite as neatly as we might think they should. So we happen to have a children's worker who's a bit of a kind of quixotic, utopian kind of thinker, and he's a storyteller by trade. And we hired him as a Sunday school teacher, and he immediately announced that he wouldn't be teaching in Sunday school. He'd be kind of founding a kind of a church of children. And then kind of they sat down and he told them the kind of gospel story, and a bit like in Christianity Rediscovered, if you know the Donovan book, they kind of listen to the kerygma and then try to elaborate some ground rules of what they thought a community built upon the gospel ought to be. And he's has the meeting out of his hand, and it's kind of turned around the life of the children in the church. But it still is kind of something that's kind of his baby, and it doesn't necessarily mean that that's kind of percolated through to the wider thinking of the church. And partly because it's quite the way he does it is quite countercultural, quite fresh. There are a number of people in the church who, he's been doing it years, and quite a number of people who have no idea what he's doing and no interest in it, and we haven't quite managed to kind of get it to filter through. And we've, and a similar case in point is that we've brought the children. We bring the children back into the sanctuary for communion. Yeah, and they are encouraged to share the bread and wine, if they want to. And I'm pleased we've done that, but I still haven't quite felt that. Still feels somewhat more like a pious, good intention on our part than an achieved reality of kind of intergenerational, oneness. That, and I thought I'd share something in the chat, which, as Simon at least may know, I grew up strict Baptist, and this is I don't know if anyone's heard of Philpott and Tiptaft. They're quite well known in strict Baptist circles. This is Philpott's son writing about his 19th century upbringing. There was nothing I should mention that my father distrusted more than infant piety. I thought this is a good example of the kind of attitude that she's talking about. For long he was opposed to Sunday schools till he had to give way before the general consensus of his followers. But he did not cease to insist that children should never be taught or allowed to use the language of appropriation, to sing, for instance, Rock of Ages cleft for me, or my Jesus hath done all things well. Herein he was quite logical. For though by early influence and example you can bring up a child to be a little patriot, a little Catholic, a little Calvinist, a little Bolshevist, and perhaps even a little citizen of the world, no power on earth, he would have maintained, can make him a child of God, unless his name has been written in the Lamb's Book of Life. That's the I kind of grew up steeped in that kind of attitude, I guess. Like Simon says, that can be rebarbative and traumatic and deeply wounding for kids, but I found it quite exciting as a sense that there was a kind of a mystery and a step beyond, and a kind of something to which to graduate.
I think the loads of stuff interesting there. I would imagine quite a lot of children workers and youth workers would have a similar experience, that what they do with children and young people sits outside and is unknown to what the rest of the church is doing. So
and if they're any good, it's almost like people breathe a sigh of relief and they're like, oh, amazing, we've got a ministry that's working. Let's leave over there and concentrate on other stuff.
Yeah. And I still continue to play with, I've argued, and actually our church has just changed its practice, that children are now receiving full communion. They've always been part of communion services for a long time, but they weren't receiving the bread and wine, but receiving something different. And we've shifted that. But I wonder, I'm still challenged by the fact that if we give everything to children almost from the beginning, how do we lose something of the mystery and the sense of discovering something, or there's something not yet for me? I'm not, and that, I think that picks up a little bit in that sense of if we so affirm, it's just a difficulty, I think, of wanting to help people to grow in faith, and you don't want to put them right outside of that so that everything is completely unknown, But if you make everything known, where do you move from? Where do you journey to? And I continue to kind of play with some of that.
I remember having an argument with our minister when I was 10. I decided that it was time for me to be baptized because I had had a sort of inner moving of the Spirit and a conviction that this was something I wanted to commit myself to. And he said, "You're far too young. You need to wait and, come back to me in a few years." And then he said, "But you can take communion if you want to. Would that help?" And I thought to myself, no, it really wouldn't. If I'm not good enough to meet Jesus in the pool, I'm not good enough to take food with him. And I can remember thinking that really clearly when this was offered to me. So I spent 4 years very deliberately every communion service, which is, morning and evening, so once a month in the morning, once a month in the evening, I would sit on the front row and decline communion. And it was 4 years later, he finally said to me, "Okay, do you want to talk about baptism?"
But again, yeah, that is some of the challenges, isn't it? Because part of us would go, "Oh, we've got a 10-year-old who wants to be baptized. Let's baptize them." And I kind of, because actually, in my experience of being a youth worker some years ago, and still now thinking about it, if you've got somebody who wants to be baptized, telling them to wait ends up means potentially that they never get baptized. And I have so many young people who have an evident faith, but because they weren't baptized in their teenage years, it becomes too much of a big thing to then be baptized in their 20s. At the same time, a 10-year-old is I want to honor where they are, but it's not the same as being a 14 or 16-year-old. And this is the challenges, I think, around how we do this well, which is why I think there was a lot of wisdom, and it was very important that the Whitley Lectures committee decided to have a lecture that thought about children, and maybe we need to have some more. And obviously Linda's done one more recently for us as well. James, I don't know if you want to, any of your own experience of these issues. And yeah,
nothing particularly profound to offer. So our church, when we arrived, ours were the only children, and we went through a number of years where there didn't seem a lot of point doing a Sunday school, a bit like Simon now, because it was them, and normally it was one of us going out with them, and you end up thinking, well, we could just stay at home and do this and be more comfortable in a warm room. But slowly over time that's changed, and we have tried to move the church to a place where all the children are accepted, so they're welcome to stay in any part of any service, and they do contribute to a certain degree. Readings, prayers, some of them help with the tech sometimes because they understand it better than the grown-ups do. But what we haven't got to, and I was challenged again reading this, is actually how do we create space in which they can speak to the adults on a spiritual level and challenge our spirituality. Then I was also, just while you guys were talking, I was standing here thinking about it from the other direction, and I feel like often we send children out to Sunday school because we feel like what's going on in the main service wouldn't work for them, would be boring, they wouldn't understand it, and then the question is, well, how many of the adults does that actually work for? When we've, a 20-minute, half-hour sermon, chucking in a bit of Greek, very monologue style, and then this set time of worship. I wonder if we could learn from children actually about how all of us could engage more in spirituality, and whether there's something to be done there without just turning it into an all-age service, whatever we mean by that.
Yeah,
I think that's a lot of kind of where Anne's trying to get us to think about, isn't it? That, Andy, what you're saying sounds like, we need to do things for the children, but this is about how can we learn from them? How can we do this together? So that we're respecting what they bring. And Hay and I it's interesting, isn't it? As you say, they were just doing this research when she was writing this book, but they're now well recognized as, having done considerable research on children's spirituality. The work they've done has helped us to see that the way children will speak about their faith, about spiritual things, it will be different. The language, it's a different kind of vocabulary than we might want to, you know, as adults would hold. And there's that kind of, so how do we value that, you know, and how do we value and give space for those conversations, that it's not belittling the children and not, you know, not lessening what's happening for adults as well, but it's some way of appreciating and valuing and that authenticity, and how we belong together. I don't know.
And as part of that, sorry, go on.
Yeah, I was just going to say it's not easy, but it's, you know,
Yeah.
this is the stuff, isn't it? I think that's important. Cool.
I was just going to say, as part of that as well, we've been starting to think about actually what does it look like to include children in our church meetings to help us discern. And again, I don't know the answer, but if Anne's argument is compelling, which I think it is, then, and we are willing to offer them communion, then surely their voices should be part of all our discernment as a church.
Yeah, it's interesting. I've been trying to help my church see play as something positive, and that we should all be playful. And you know, we see it in the lectures. She talks at that one point about, you know, play was scorned. And I think we have this particular view that play is something trivial, rather than play as being something perhaps even integral to us being human beings. And that's having a big sense of what play might mean. And I do wonder if that there is something there, you know, so it's the godly play in terms of its wondering. And actually that's been one way that I've tried to help my own church, because wonderings are, anyone can wonder. There is no right or wrong answers. It's what, you know, so wondering, trying to do something with a picture or you know, a particular biblical story. But actually, it's again, I think for me, one of the challenges is helping the whole congregation, children and adults, enter into this time of mutual exchange, because actually our children I think are not used to it, as our adults are not used to it. So it's not as though I think, you know, there's this it's learning to be that congregation. And you know, I think some of what, you know, we're trying to do, I guess, is trying to help our congregations. But I think also, what last thing then I'll let you know is how many of us as ministers are actually that interested in our children and young people. Now, I think partly because of my own story, my mum was someone who, you know, taught early years, and my wife is early years as well, specialist. That has challenged my way of thinking about children, as well as just finding, you know, those kind of interests. But most ministers, I think, love the idea that someone else is looking after the children. And it was interesting that one retired minister said to me once that if he was to do it all over again, he would take a much closer interest and participation in the work amongst children and young people, seeing that as perhaps the most important thing that a church might be doing, as well. Yeah.
I was going to say Jason Gardner, who wrote a book, Mend the Gap, about 12, 13 years ago, talked about the fact that churches in about this time, 2000, realised they were no longer connecting with their children and young people. So rather than find ways to do what you just described, which is for congregations and children and people to get together, they employed someone to do it for them, and they called them youth workers. And he said, I was one of those. But actually all that's done is it's maintained that division. And I don't, it's an interest, that's one big difference between how Anne describes Baptist churches then to now. But there are a lot of children's and youth and families workers who we've already heard of one being mentioned. And I know John Roberta, who's an intergenerational author, talks about the church being like a Van Gogh Mickey Mouse symbol. And the Mickey Mouse symbol has a big circle and two little circles for ears. And if you take one away, like Van Gogh only had one ear, a slightly crude example, but he says that's what most churches have become in his setting in North America. Then the main circle is the church adult congregation. And then there's a young persons and children section. And there's no interaction. He says when the church says, why do the young people leave church and get other churches when they grow up? Well, they never were part of the church.
Yeah.
I think it'd be really interesting. How do we think? Have we farmed out children and youth to specialists as ministers? And I think you're probably right. And maybe the fact there's only 6 of us here rather than the 10 or 12 you normally get, does that reflect it? Churches themselves often are quite happy to hand it over. So I'd be interested to know what other people think, if that's a good thing, a helpful thing, or if that's masking again our church's desire to stay separate and stay sort of apart.
I've said for quite a long time, whenever I'm asked, that if you want to see children, young people grow into church, into their adulthood, they need to have more. They need to have several significant relationships outside of their youth worker.
Yeah.
Slightly
That's my own story. Yeah.
Slightly outside the box, but maybe not so much, because I'm thinking it actually integrates some of the things we've been saying about play and about space of mutual exchange. When I was growing up, I think, perhaps where I most strongly experienced kind of intergenerational mutual exchange in church was on camps. Nowhere, family camps. So specifically, not kind of send the kids away and get all excited chasing around, but a particular family camp that we would go on each year, where a bunch of Christians were in a field round the corners, and then there was a bit of Bible teaching and a bit of round the campfire and a fish and chip supper. And it was that sense of building holy community, and particularly a community rooted in nature, but also that kind of playing house, which camping essentially is for us. And maybe for my own kids and for my own church, to the extent I've managed to get people along, which is not very much, Greenbelt has been a bit of a similar thing, in that it's been a kind of place where some of the distinctions between adults and children just are naturally not eroded. They're not really so relevant when you're all working out, where's the tap, and maybe in terms of that kind of dialectic of feast and fast and temple and wilderness thing, maybe things like that, be they festivals or camps or whatever, aren't actually an optional extra. Maybe they're really quite a non-negotiable part of how we make Christian community.
Yeah.
I don't know if you found that. You're a Greenbelter, Andy. Have you found it playing that sort of role in?
Well, with my own children, yes. They love Greenbelt, and I don't know whether that's just about going camping, and which we don't really do outside of Greenbelt. But yeah, I think
I think of it as something that not only do my kids love it, and did I love doing that as a child, but also as a sense of realizing a kind of imaginative, realizing the kind of plausibility of some of the gospel language.
Yeah. But I think it is about those, it goes back to someone you were talking about mystery, it was something before that I moved to Southend, and it was something that we began doing in Stevenage when I was there. But I've continued, and now got my own children, is we get everyone up for the Easter dawn service. So it's the one day in the year where we actually wake our children so they might come to church in the dark and hear the story. And I guess I learned that a little bit from, there was a wonderful blog by a guy called Ben Myers. He doesn't blog anymore, but you can find the blog on his Faith and Theology, where he talked about taking his kids to the Easter dawn service, which is completely out of what you would normally do. And I think it's giving sometimes those experiences of mysterious kind of things, of whether it might be, we're going to stay up late, and it was interesting reading the Archbishop of Canterbury's Lent book, Tarrying, Selina Stone, reflecting on largely on Pentecostal kind of Christianity, and about, how the whole church children included, would wait on God for half a night of prayer kind of thing. And given those experiences, which were suddenly, it's not to say that we can't encounter God on the normal Sunday morning, but sometimes it is about encountering God in those different kind of spaces, whether it's going off together for a camp, or doing something different. And I think that's just and we don't do those things for children. Actually, we do it for the whole church, to have those moments of mystery and and feasting, fasting. So yeah, I think there's a lot in that which helps nurture faith because it's experiential as well.
It's interesting that the Jesus in the temple thing, happens in that context where you've got a child.
They've
go.
gone to the festival. Yeah.
I liked the point. I can't find the quote now, but she said something like, many people have learned more truth by reading Narnia than they have by reading Dawkins and Brief History of Time. And I just thought that was really true. There's something about a childish ability to fuse the imaginative world with the real world because they're not quite separate yet. And I really love that because that's where truth can be found, in that sort of strange place where reality and imagination haven't quite been ripped apart from each other.
Yeah, I've spent the first part of this year reading all Catherine Rundell's novels. She's a children's writer, although she's written some adult stuff, and the stories are absolutely brilliant in terms of, I don't know if she is a Christian. There seems to be some of that kind of going on a little bit, but not in a obvious way. But the books, and equally, I think Philip Pullman, although he's definitely not a Christian, but the way that he explores some of those things in children, it's that playful. There are things that you can do. Absolutely
brilliant.
Yeah. At the same time, I still enjoy a good. Whatever she talks about, a little bit of Stephen Hawking or Isaac Newton, and it's so for me it's kind of I want to do that thing where the children are there, but I still think there's a place, probably not for a 25-30 minute, James, but a 15-minute kind of sermon monologue. I still think that can do something for a congregation, and so for me, I guess it's those. A good church has a richness of experiences.
I definitely don't think that the monologue sermon is dead. I mean, I just don't think it is at all. I don't think it's the only way of communicating, but people are quite happy to sit and listen to a podcast for half an hour or so I think the long form exposition, and the reason people don't like it a lot of the time is it's rubbish. Whereas, a sermon that's interesting is and takes you somewhere is great. And I remember once Ruth Goldborn saying that she was very glad for growing up in church and sitting there listening to sermons, because eventually she came to understand the sermons and came to love them. But in the period when they were just boring, she learned a very important life skill, which is how to sit quiet for half an hour when you're bored.
I read a children's story on Sunday to a congregation I was a visiting preacher to, and I knew that it was all going to be an elderly congregation, and they absolutely loved it. And there's that sense too, I think, in what I'm saying, in the the theological reflection bit as well, that we are meant to be, we are still children. And thinking of how we embody that and how we still do that.
It's recently this week there's been a bit of on Twitter about, someone tweeted about how the hungry caterpillar can be a way of telling the gospel, to which others have then started to chuck in their own children's stories, to which I started to think, oh, could I get away with that? And then I'm thinking I've got to then find a way to shoehorn a Bible passage into why I'm using the story. But yes, I think for me it is coming back to this word play, and rediscovering play as something that actually we need to do throughout our lives. I agree, Linda. We remain children, but once we become adults, we're not just children. We are also now adults, and and that, again, for me, that's about honouring is we don't let go of our being children. But Rowan Williams does some interesting stuff in his book Lost Icons, where he talks about we have a load of childish adults who have not really grown up and matured. In the same way, we have a lot of children who we're forcing into adultness way too early. And it's, again, for me, it's how do we honor those, that way of, that God designed us as people who were born at a new age and have those growing experiences. And, Jesus came at 0. He didn't come at 12, and he didn't come at 33 or 30. You know, all of those things are to be honoured and enjoyed.
I mean, can I ask, as a Baptist denomination, whether we have reached the point where we take this really seriously? I mean, having a look at probably the most interactive multi-generational type of initiative in the last 20 years has been Messy Church, coming out of an Anglican context. I know the Methodist denomination, they have intergenerational mission enablers. They have a department with a youth president, and yet I would have always said the Baptists were much more child-friendly than the other denominations were. So is it that we need to reach a real crisis point before we start to being willing to adapt? Or do we have the capacity, do you think, to make this a priority now before it's too late? Because I slightly worry reading what Anne has written and listening to what the ministers are. Our children numbers have gone down. It seems to be bigger churches that are the only ones that are holding on to them. Is it a bit too late now? That she's talking about a group of people, children within churches, that there's now less and less and less of them. Do you think we as Baptists can adapt to this? Or will we, again, leave it a little bit late to do anything? Which is a fairly depressing question, but it's
well, I would imagine quite a lot of Baptist churches, my own, is doing some form of Messy Church. I'm not sure if the Anglicans and the Methodists have more money to throw at some of these things, it feels like.
Yeah.
I'm not sure the results are much better. I think we're all finding our way, and there are probably loads of just great stories and examples that we just don't hear. I do think if you think about ministerial formation, how much actually engages what it means to be a minister of the whole church and children is probably not there. And again, if we, rightly or wrongly, ministers shape congregations. And if you have a minister who cares about children and the place of children and listening to their voices, that will shape the whole church then if you don't have that, you know, and others can play a role, but ministers hold that power to do that. So I think there is perhaps something about ministerial formation. So we probably, you know, it's not that it's not there, but it's done in a very quick, short way, and then you move on to other things. I'm an advocate that ministerial formation should be a lot longer for everybody, because I think there's a lot more that people need to think about and be formed in before they can be fully ministers. But yeah, I don't know, Linda.
In terms of the relationship between minister and the children in the church, as a minister who is child-free, but really likes being around children. You know, I've got 5 nephews. I actually enjoy being around kids, but because we haven't got our own children, we've never had that kind of in with the church kids. And there's almost this kind of, well, Simon won't want to have anything to do with the children then, because, you know, he's obviously a child hater because they haven't had children. And it's been this really weird thing that people don't mean to do it, but there is that thing there which I've never found a way around.
Yeah, and that's where I think, again, you know, the whole theory is about this wonderful, sometimes it feels like this wonderful utopian vision of intergenerational thing. Actually, intergenerational is really hard work, because there are a load of adults who feel uncomfortable about children. There are children who feel uncomfortable around adults, and so learning that and engendering that, I think, is a really long-term program. But again, I don't know. I say to my people who work with our children, I don't care whether they know a Bible verse. The most important thing is that you take an interest in them, that they know that actually what's going on in their life can be brought to God in prayer. I think it's just the most important thing for a child and into teenage years, that they know that people are interested in them and that God is interested in them and in their lives. Everything else, I think, is an add-on and can fall in and fold in and around that. Which says to me, actually, any adult really can engage with children. You know, you don't have to be the expert, but you can take an interest and learn their name and see them as a voice within the congregation. Yeah,
we tried something with talent shows, and that's been a really interesting way of saying everyone's got a talent, young, old, and so the young people, one of them brings his mountain bike and showed a video of him jumping over hideously high jumps. Another, an adult brought a poem, and it was really interesting. It's a bit like we're talking there about Greenbelt. It's trying to, if different generations like oil and water and they don't naturally mix, how do we as ministers and churches stir them together occasionally to get them to come together, and trying to find those things, as you say, when it's a comfortable, like a church picnic's another example, when actually they are comfortable mixing with each other. And then that's when relationships go and people learn shared interests. But it is, you're right, Andy, it is hard work. Yeah.
But I think but we can do that within our own worship services, you know, so, and I think it comes back to, again, Linda, some of your work that you've done around communion. A more playful understanding of communion allows, I think, a lot more to go on. And that's challenging this idea that communion should, you know, and it's not to say that it should never be this. And that's what I've always said to my congregation. I think there's a place for the kind of somber, quiet, reflective communion, because I think that is the nature of what it is. But actually, there is also the place for the playful, wondering, everyone getting out their seats to come and receive the bread and the wine, and, you know, that sense of movement. And you know, again, we've had a couple of communions where it has felt like there's this holy thing going on. But if you step back, it's like a huge mess. And so I think there are things actually within our own work, you know, we don't, I think you're right. We need the talent shows, we need the festivals, we need those things, but we can also do it within a worship setting. It's about play, it's about imagination, it's about, you know, saying actually we can do something different. But I guess in my experience, without that ever becoming like this perfect answer, which means it will always be like that every week, it's snatching those moments where you think, oh, that was brilliant. And I guess yeah, what am I trying to do within my own congregation? I'm trying to leave every child and every adult particular memories, which they can carry on and think about and reflect and wonder on. Is our worship memorable? And again, it might not be every week, but are we creating memorable moments, which I don't know. Because again, you know, so much of childhood is about, well, a good, healthy childhood is about those opportunities to make those memories, and whether it's about going on holiday or a particular moment in life which is challenging, those things. But I don't know if that's answered your question, Simon, but in terms of, I do think as a union, we should be thinking and talking and exploring, listening.
Yeah.
You know,
and I think there are signs, aren't there? So the CYF Roundtable, there's the Young Adults Roundtable, there's work that Linda's done. It is starting to come through. So there was an intergenerational away day program, Today Not Tomorrow, that we did as a church, which used to be on the Baptist Union website, but now has disappeared because I don't think anyone did it. But I think, you know, there are signs that things are moving forward. It's just interesting looking at other denominations, seeing that they've moved forward a bit earlier than we have. Maybe that's because they've got less kids than we have, and therefore more. I don't know, but there is some. You're right. There is some good stuff going on there.
Yeah, I guess we haven't created a something, you know, Messy Church is international, interdenominational. It's created this huge thing, and in some ways it is very Anglican, and we all have to adapt it if we're doing it into our own setting. We haven't created something like that, have we, within our own? That I guess, yes, that I would love to see some more written, reflective story sharing of what we're doing in our churches, and I would imagine there would be some really exciting, imaginative, wonderful things, which might be a bit more inspiring, as well as, you know, that's not to take from actually it's deeply challenging and there are some really stories where it's really hard, but we haven't done that kind of work. Well, we got to 9 o'clock. Thank you, everyone. It's been, I've enjoyed this conversation. I've enjoyed every one of the conversations, just taking some time to think around whatever the topic of the Whitley lecture was. And hopefully as this recording is shared, others will watch it and others will go away and read. As I've come away from each one of these, hoping that that more people will go away and read some of these Whitley lectures, because there's so much for us to reponder. Some of us to reponder, some of us to ponder for the first time. Yes, and I think it was a very important thing that Anne was asked to give that lecture at that moment in our history and in our story. We're back next month if you're around. We're jumping some Whitley lectures to 2003. and it will be the Whitley lecture called Tradition and Renewal of Baptist Life, I think it was the title, given by Steve Holmes, which you'll be welcome to come back.